I must start this video with a short disclaimer. Simply that the whole idea of there being a best episode of a show is often a bit fatuous and a bit silly. A show like Gravity Falls is a fortunate show for us TV fans because it is a show where there are so many good episodes and where these episodes are good in so many different ways. Gravity Falls, while not diffuse, is quite versatile. The show can be comedic, it can be dramatic, it can be self-contained, it can be serialized. There are a lot of different and diverging modes that the show takes on, and it does so quite well. What I would say is most often considered the best episode of the show is Not What He Seems. And that's a great episode. It's tense, it's pulse-pounding, it's exhilarating, it's exquisitely paced, it reveals a lot of information without seeming merely like a blunt hammer of exposition. And it, most importantly, forces characters into a situation where they have to make choices that say a lot about who they really are and what they want for themselves. But that's not my favorite episode of the show. I've decided that as I've kept watching and rewatching different episodes, laughing and smiling, and often being sent into a place of profound contemplation. Not What He Seems, I don't want to be contrarian and say anything negative against that episode, because, as I said, that's a fantastic, very solid episode. But the episode that says the most to me about this show, the episode that best encapsulates everything I truly love about the show, is a bit different. It is Dipper and Mabel versus the future. This episode is a sort of climax for the show. It is not, of course, the ending. There are several more episodes in the multi-part grand finale, and some of them are quite brilliant and imaginative. My favorite being the Mabel's Bubble episode. But Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future is nonetheless the episode that has characters make decisions that encapsulate their journeys up to this point, while nonetheless not feeling merely like a repetition of what the show has already done. No show is about merely one thing, no show that's good at least, but what Gravity Falls works best for me as is a show about the contemplation of, enjoyment of, and ultimately the dissolution of youthful idealism. Dipper is ultimately as much a victim of this idealism as Mabel, and he does not realize it. That's not to say Mabel isn't guilty of this idealism, and the show confronts with elucidating, piercing clarity the flaws in her childlike vision of the world. But it also demonstrates Dipper finally getting everything that he wants and having to deal with the consequences of that. These consequences are not immediately apparent when you're Dipper and you're dancing on these fantasies about what your life would be like if everything went your way, without having to deal with what is lost when everything does. Gravity Falls is not a cynical show. It is not a callous show. It is a very vibrant, very enjoyable show. It can be absolutely enjoyed by younger audiences who are not particularly attuned to the deeper and more unnerving and disorienting ideas that it's dealing with. Nonetheless, it is also a show that profoundly cloaks this wondrous summer, the summer of enjoyment and mirth, with that hint of melancholy, that hint of this is all going to come to an end. There's a sense of subtle, bittersweet fatalism that the show uses this episode to provide a brilliant and poignant resolution to. There's a sense of tragedy here in the Aristotelian sense. For Aristotle, what makes tragedy work is that it is what a character must inevitably do. Characters must behave not in, say, the way that an audience might expect them to behave, certainly not in the way that a normal person might necessarily behave, as too much bad film criticism wrongly assumes, not in the quote-unquote rationalist way, as if there was a single unitary rationalist way of acting, but in the way that fits the person that they have been established as being. Character X has certain personality traits and they are placed in situation Y, so they inevitably react in a certain way. That is satisfying, Aristotle understands. And yeah, it is a bit fatalistic. It is a sense that there are challenges that we cannot avoid, even if we're at our smartest and wittiest and most discerning, because they relate to what is fundamental to us. So you're given a character like, say, to use a Shakespearean example, Lear. Lear is established as someone consumed with pride, someone who demands constant adulation. So when he is placed in a situation that requires him to choose between satiating his pride and abandoning that pride to see through deceptions, he ultimately falls victim to that pride. But it does not necessarily have to be this character has a certain flaw. That's important. It is for, say, Lear or Othello. But sometimes bad things simply happen because they are what must happen when someone makes a certain series of decisions that they will inevitably make, being the person that we know they are. Think about Antony and Cleopatra. That's a brilliant play, one of Shakespeare's best, because it's not that Antony is a bad person necessarily. He's certainly derided by the Romans, but the play is very ambiguous whether his relationship with Cleopatra is ultimately positive or not. But because he is someone who needs this relationship, someone who is going inevitably to choose it based on his weariness with the Roman way of life and with this constant martial military view of existence, he ends up in these negative situations. And the result is not so much, oh hey, look at this guy making a bad decision, as, oh, that could happen to anyone. It can happen to even the brightest, smartest person in the world. Because we inevitably end up in situations where we act in one of the only ways that we are ever going to act. One of the only ways that is true to who we are. And while that decision might not be quote-unquote bad, it leads to us ending in a negative position. Think about Dipper here. Unlike Mabel, he does not make the quote-unquote wrong decision. You could say that his choice to be Ford's apprentice is correct. It is the fulfillment of his longings throughout the show. But there is nonetheless a sense of loss in all of that breathless sense of wonder and sense of enjoyment. Even if situations had not unfolded the way that they did, with Mabel finding out in an inopportune time and being tricked by Bill, Dipper wanting to be Ford's apprentice would nonetheless have forced a rift between them. Mabel and Dipper are closely paralleled with Stan Lee and Stan Ford, two brothers who were very close as children and yet grew apart due to simple childish mistakes and misunderstandings that developed into bitterness, but also simply because one brother had these grand ideals of what he thought he could achieve, and those ideals necessarily took him away from the other brother. It's a complicated issue. Dipper, without any act of malice, nonetheless hurts Mabel. And that hurt should be taken as serious. It should not be ignored. But it should also not be considered that Dipper is entirely in the wrong, because he's not. His failure is to have this narrow, honestly a bit childish view of his ambitions. He clings to this fantasy of having everything he wants and there not being any consequences to that. Every choice is also a choice to not do something else. Choosing to be Ford's apprentice is also the choice not to grow up with Mabel. And he understands that by the end of this episode and by the end of the series, and he ultimately chooses to grow up with Mabel. Mabel, meanwhile, continues to cling to this hope of nothing ever changing. And yet, this is fundamentally incorrect. Summer is ending, and on a broader sense, this era of childhood bliss is ending. Mabel is not wrong to enjoy that bliss, but she is wrong, the show suggests, for attempting to ignore the truth that this bliss is inevitably transient. She is like the Lotus Eaters of Homer and Tennyson, numbing herself with fantasies, as best exemplified in the Mabel's Bubble episode. Ultimately, these two need to grow up. They do not need to necessarily to grow apart in the same way that Ford and Stan did, but they do need to face the world as it is, without projections and without fantasies. They need to, and this is as important for Dipper as it is for Mabel, diverge from their narrow and rather insular ambitions and projections about what the future would be like, and face the consequences of their aspirations. They need to negotiate between them what the future should be like for the both of them, and that's hard and that's necessary. And Dipper and Mabel versus the future illustrates this conflict and the tragedy it inevitably comes to, with a touch that is not heavy-handed but is very precise, and it is very poignant. This is what the show inevitably must come to, and the show is brilliant in elucidating that. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching Gravity Falls. It's a great show, and it has a lot of rewatchability. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. That I promise you. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.